All right, how's that? Can people see my shared screen?
Good.
Wonderful. So today we're going to finish off by looking at a historical case study. Now, Keith and I thought that it would be helpful to have at least one session where we're slightly looking back, just so that it sinks in that this is not a new discussion really in the church. It's true that we're at a very specific, particular, unique point in the wake or in the midst of this pandemic situation and the shifting cultural contexts of the 21st century. This isn't the first time that people have had to rethink or reimagine the church. In fact, people have been doing this at different points for a very, very long time. And so we're looking at Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his specific location geographically and historically, and the context in which he had to reimagine the church. I can hear a little bit of echo, and I want this to be as clear as possible for people who haven't been hearing very well. So do again, please mute yourselves if you're not already. And otherwise, Keith will just viciously mute you. Okay, so who are we talking about? We're looking at Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who lived from 1906 to 1945. And he was a German Lutheran pastor and university lecturer. He had this kind of dual career where he's both a church minister and an academic. And he's a very prolific academic writer, as well as a very prolific preacher, a very full pastoral portfolio, if you like, taking care of youth groups in deprived parts of Berlin and doing all sorts of pastoral work, as well as being an academic. One of his most famous texts might be Life Together. Lots of people seem to have come across that. He also wrote The Cost of Discipleship and other works that have become very popular in the English-speaking world. He lived mainly in Germany and is, as we'll see, very attached to his country. But he's quite unique in his generation in that he also lived in England. He lived in London for 2 years while he was pastoring 2 expat German churches in London. He also lived in Spain, where he was working at a church in Barcelona, and he lived in the US in New York when he was doing a study abroad year at New York Theological Seminary. So he's very, very well traveled for someone of his age at that time period. And that perhaps gives him the ability to look at the German situation from the outside, if you like. He's a key member of the Confessing Church, and I want to just pause for a minute here and talk about what does this mean? What is the Confessing Church? Well, as we'll see, during the 1930s, with the rise of Hitler and the increasing power of Nazism in Germany, there arose within the church first a kind of concern and then distress about how ideas and ideologies from Nazism were kind of infiltrating themselves into the church, into church practices, into church preaching, and also, perhaps most tellingly, into the church hierarchy. So the Lutheran Church, the Evangelische Kirche in Germany, is the state church. And therefore, it's a political game, if you like, to see who's going to be appointed into the important hierarchical roles in this church. And political leaders have a lot of clout in terms of who gets to be, this important bishop and that important bishop. And so more and more Nazi sympathizers were being made or given very big hierarchical positions within the church. And the Confessing Church grew out of some people's desire to not see the church become, as they saw, corrupted by this Nazi influence. And it became a breakaway church that saw itself as the true church of Germany, while the Reich Church, the state church, was being kind of infiltrated by Nazism. He was profoundly ecumenical and was a key figure in European ecumenical circles in the 1930s. He preached a very or gave a very famous talk at a 1936 ecumenical conference in Fano in Finland, 1936, I think, about peace and how the ecumenical church could bring peace and avert catastrophe if only all the churches could band together across Europe and across ecumenical divides, denominational divides, in order to work for peace across nations and across churches. Of course, as we know, this didn't happen, and war broke out in 1939, and he became a counter-espionage agent during World War II, which led eventually to his arrest, as we'll see in 1943. So I just wanted to give you a bit of background on the person. This is obviously a bit of a cursory sketch because we only have an hour and a half, and I want there to be plenty of time for us to have discussion. But please, if you have any questions that I'm not covering here about who Bonhoeffer was and what his life was like, just please raise them. Either as we go along, although I can't really see you, so you need to attract Keith's attention in some way, or save them for the end. So we need to talk about the Barmen Declaration. In 1934, this group that I was just talking about, the Confessing Church, believes that they've reached a crisis point and they need to make a declaration of faith to distance themselves from what's happening in the state church and the Reich Church. And the key phrase in their declaration is this, the one that you see commemorated on this stamp that marks 50 years of the Barmen Declaration. Jesus Christ is the one word of God. And the reason that they felt they had to make this, what might seem to us pretty simple, basic statement, is because the way that Hitler was being portrayed in Nazi ideology was that he was in some way the envoy of God. He was the savior that was going to bring Germany back to greatness and complete God's work in Germany. And so the Barmen Declaration begins by quoting from the Gospel of John, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And then, truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved." And having quoted these passages from John, the statement of the Barmen Declaration, the first statement that they make is that Jesus Christ, as he is attested for us in Holy Scripture, is the one word of God, which we have to hear and which we have to trust and obey in life and death. And the second point that they make is we reject false doctrine, as though the church could and would have to acknowledge as a source of its proclamation, apart from and besides this one word of God, still other events and powers, figures and truths as God's revelation. So here they're saying, you know, we know that there is this doctrine out there in our context that says we can acknowledge other revelations of God. We can acknowledge Hitler as a revelation of God, but we are not going to do that. We reject this false doctrine. So it's a church that's making a statement about being in a crisis, being pushed towards accepting things that they don't want to accept. And they're saying, here's what we believe. We believe in Jesus Christ as the one word of God. And we're not going to budge on this. We're not going to accept the idea that Hitler might also be in some way the revelation of God. I'm kind of banging home the context a little bit here before we get to a discussion of how Bonhoeffer is reimagining church, because it's really in order to understand why he has to reimagine church and where he's going to go with that, it's important to first understand what the context is that he is working in. So just a few more facts on our historical context here. Throughout the 30s, we see Hitler rising to ever-increasing power. And the Confessing Church Seminary that Bonhoeffer had been running, so he comes home from London to run a Confessing Church Seminary to train people to be ministers in the Confessing Church. That seminary was closed by the Gestapo in August 1937. By this point, Bonhoeffer is really labeled as a problem person in Nazi Germany. And by 1938, he's no longer allowed to speak in public or to publish or to teach at the University of Berlin. World War I begins on the 1st of September 1939. And in 1940, October 1940, Bonhoeffer joins the Abwehr. Now, this is the intelligence service, the German government intelligence service. But through Bonhoeffer's contacts, largely his family contacts, he comes from a big, very politically engaged family. He knows that there are some units within this espionage service that are in fact working against Hitler and trying to bring down Hitler's power, working with the Allies to try to fix up how a new government could be formed with the Allies' help after Hitler's overthrow. I'm just going to close my door just a moment here. Other excitement happening in my house at the moment. So Bonhoeffer joins the Abwehr in October 1940 in one of these units that he knows are actually undercover working against Hitler. And he uses, as part of his work, all his ecumenical contacts throughout Europe that he's made during the 30s, attending all these ecumenical conferences. He uses these contacts to go and talk to people in other countries in Europe and try to meet their church leaders to say, can you influence your government to work with us for when we've overthrown Hitler and the Allies come into Germany, to set up some new form of government with us. And so it's kind of interesting to see how Bonhoeffer's church contacts suddenly become his political contacts during the Second World War. That's a whole different thing we can talk about later. In the middle of the war, 5th of April 1943, Bonhoeffer is arrested and he's held in Tegel military interrogation prison in Berlin. But we're getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Before we get on to some more facts about Bonhoeffer's life, it's time to take a break and talk about some of the things that he's writing and his thinking about the church, so that we can trace the development of his thinking about the church as we go through these years of his life. So as the church crisis intensifies in Germany, Bonhoeffer writes this essay called Guilt, Justification and Renewal, probably written towards the end of 1941. This essay is collected into his massive book of ethics. If you want some light reading, avoid that one, but it is really excellent stuff. Here in this particular essay, Bonhoeffer is talking about how society as a whole can hope to be renewed eventually after this whole crisis is past. So he's already looking ahead to what might happen after the war. And here we get into the nitty-gritty of his theological thinking. And he says, the issue is the process by which Christ takes form among us. Therefore, the issue is the real, judged, and renewed human being. For Bonhoeffer, only Christ is this real, judged, and renewed human being. Only the person taken on in Christ is the real human being. Only through Christ can we become this real human being. Only the person confronted by the cross of Christ is the judged human being. Only the person who participates in the resurrection of Christ is the renewed human being. So we see here that on an individual level, he's saying that each person has to, if you like, he's saying has to be taken on in Christ. We could say has to be conformed to Christ. That's the language that he uses elsewhere. And by being taken on or by being conformed to Christ, the human being can become real, judged, and renewed. And elsewhere, he talks about this threefold movement by talking about the incarnation, becoming a real human, being judged on the cross, and being renewed through the resurrection. So we can see that kind of threefold process being echoed in this text here. So what does this mean for the church? Well, he carries on the next page to say, the church today is the community of people who, grasped by the power of Christ's grace, acknowledge, confess, and take upon themselves not only their personal sins, but also the Western world's falling away from Jesus Christ as guilt towards Jesus Christ. The church is where Jesus makes his form real in the midst of the world. Therefore, only the church can be the place of personal and corporate rebirth and renewal. Now, you may at this point go, whoa, that's a really high view, if you like, of the church, when he says only the church can be the place of personal and corporate rebirth and renewal. And that's, a valid response, but we have to admit that that is exactly what Bonhoeffer thinks. At this point in his life, the church is the locus for personal renewal, rebirth and renewal. You can't get that for Bonhoeffer. You cannot get this outside of the church. It is absolutely non-negotiable. The church is where these things happen. So we can, when we talk about what is church, what is this thing that we're trying to reimagine, we can look at different people's definitions of it. And this is one right here that we could debate and discuss. And so the church really has this, is in this unique position where it, not only members of the church take on their own sin and confess that sin and acknowledge it, but they also take upon themselves this guilt of the whole of the Western world because it has fallen away from Jesus Christ, which is a very, very big theological claim. But we can find running through Bonhoeffer's late theology this idea that being part of the church means that you take on guilt, which might not even be technically, if you like, it might not even technically be your own guilt, but you take on the guilt of the world. And we can come back to this idea. So kind of clicked on the wrong thing. So as I was saying, the church takes on the guilt of the world. And he says, with this confession, the whole guilt of the world falls on the church, on Christians. And because here it is confessed and not denied, the possibility of forgiveness is opened. And this is where it starts to get very interesting, because Bonhoeffer thinks that in a church context, people can confess the guilt of the world. There is a possibility then of forgiveness taking place, but if that confession doesn't happen, the forgiveness will never come. So it's through the church that forgiveness for the world can be achieved, if you like. And so Bonhoeffer then builds this essay as a confession of guilt, and he's going to structure the essay following the 10 Commandments. And he turns each commandment into a confession of guilt. So, for example, the second commandment becomes, in his text, the church confesses that it has misused the name of Christ by being ashamed of it before the world and by not resisting strongly enough the misuse of that name for evil ends. And so we have a list of confessions that run throughout this essay, where the church is confessing its guilt in the different areas, if you like, covered by the 10 Commandments. It's a very, very strong text. But where does it lead us? It leads us to renewal, and this is where Bonhoeffer sort of begins to have a much more positive message, both for the church and for the world. It's not all about taking on guilt. There is hope for renewal. Through this confession of guilt, the church and the individual are justified by Jesus Christ and renewed. And thanks to this renewal of the church, it will be possible for the West, and here Bonhoeffer, we have to remember, is talking specifically about Germany and Western Europe. It's possible for the West, as he calls it, to be renewed, although in this case, the guilt will not be totally removed, but scarred over. And it's really interesting that Bonhoeffer thinks that in the church itself, in the church community, there can be total forgiveness and removal of guilt by God. But in the outside world, and the demarcation line is very clear here. There's the church and there's the world. In the case of the world, the guilt will sort of go away, but the scar will still be there, which is a really interesting concept about how the church can be renewed. Before we go any further, I just want to check it. Are people happy so far? Does anyone have any burning questions that we need to tackle? Is this kind of making sense? Okay, I see some nods. That's good enough then, if no one's shouting at me to answer a question. All right.
Sorry, can I just ask one question?
Sure.
This is Jeff. Just to be clear, is the church in this model of Bonhoeffer's confessing its own guilt or confessing the guilt of the world?
Oh, great question. Both. It's confessing its own guilt, and at the same time, it's confessing, it's confessing the guilt of the world, and it sees itself being caught up in that guilt. It's kind of trying to think of a good illustration of this. I may not be personally responsible for a terrible thing that happened in my neighborhood, but because I didn't really do anything about trying to prevent this terrible thing from happening, I'm not directly guilty, but I confess my kind of participation in that guilt. In the same way, he's saying, I'm not saying that every church member is responsible for Hitler's rise to power and the terrible things that are happening, but we didn't really do enough to prevent this. And so we participate in the guilt that is happening, the bad things that are happening here. Yeah. Is that good? Does that, all right, great.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so the text we were just looking at is from 1941, before Bonhoeffer's arrest. And now we're going to move into some of the ideas that come up during his time in prison so that we can kind of see a development in his thoughts. So he's in prison, arrested on the 5th of April, 1943. This is a picture of Tegel military interrogation prison. That's the cell with the cross on the top is the cell that people think he was in. So I think it's helpful to have a visual representation, even if it's just a picture on a slide, but at least we can get some sort of idea of where he is when he's writing these things. And he will never be released after his arrest in 43. He'll be in Tegel for a long time. He'll be in a different prison in Berlin for a few months the following year. And then he's taken to a succession of concentration camps, and finally Flossenburg, where he's killed in April 1945. And while he's in prison, he wrote the documents that are collected in Letters and Papers from Prison, from which you read a selection in your pre-reading for today. And I was just saying in the chat before we started that if you're interested in this time period in Bonhoeffer's life, I really do recommend that you read the whole thing, and it's not a difficult read. Ethics is a difficult read. Letters and Papers is not a difficult read because they're all letters from him, from his parents, his friend, his fiance, some musings that he writes down, some poems, and you can just kind of dip in and dip out of it, and it's a really, really fascinating insight into his daily life in prison, the things that he writes about that are important, the fact that someone has sent him some nicer tobacco so he can have a bit of a nicer smoke. Sometimes, he's very excited about that in his letters. And then you also get these deeply theological texts in this collection as well. Two main ideas that are really important for how he's going to think about church emerged during this period. The first idea is religionless Christianity, and we're going to come on to that in more detail in just a second. And the other idea is the world come of age, which I just want to explain briefly now. So for Bonhoeffer, the world come of age means that we've reached this time period where the world has become mature. And you'll have seen in some of the texts that you'll have read that he uses the analogy of a teenager who reaches adulthood. They're suddenly independent, they can make decisions on their own, they don't need a guide, a parent, a guardian to look after them anymore. And he says, now in our time, in the mid-20th century, we are the world come of age, and we don't need God anymore to tell us what to do. Because with the advance of scientific discoveries, we actually, we've been progressing for a long time. And back in the day, we would, dance to the gods when we wanted it to rain, and we don't need to do that anymore. We understand that rain just, there's a meteorological pattern, and rain will, eventually come. It doesn't matter if we dance or not. And now more and more of those questions that we thought were down to the gods or God before, we now understand the system and how these things function, and so we don't need God. But the key thing here is that he thinks that we don't need God as a question answerer. And that doesn't mean that we don't need God at all. It just means that we don't need God in that particular function of the God who looks after us and who answers our questions and who kind of holds our hand. And you may remember that phrase, the Deus ex machina, the God who zips out, into the theatre at the last moment and saves the day when everything is going pear-shaped. He kind of nips down from the clouds and kind of puts everything in order and nips back up again. That's the type of God, the Deus ex machina. That's the type of God that we don't need anymore. We can solve our own problems. So what does that mean for God then? It means that God, our conception of God, has to change. And our conception of God now becomes, in the world's maturity, a God that, instead of being at the edges of the world, that we kind of call to when we need God to come in and help, instead of being that kind of God of the periphery, God becomes a God at the center of existence. And we see, says Bonhoeffer, God in the world, not separate from the world, in the world, and even more interestingly, suffering in the world. And his theology of suffering, which we're not going to talk about too much today because we're talking about church, his theology of suffering is really interesting at this point because he sees God as a suffering God in the world. But because of this perception of God being so radically different in this mature world, his perception of church is going to be really influenced by these ideas too. So we've got the world come of age idea, and then we've got religionless Christianity. So let's talk about that now. Another shot from inside the prison here. Now in prison, Bonhoeffer questions the connection between Christianity and religion, which we've kind of touched on already today a little bit. And he says in one of the letters that you read for today, we are approaching a completely religionless age. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. It's interesting here that Bonhoeffer clearly is seeing a separation between Christianity and religion. He carries on, if religion is only the garb in which Christianity is clothed, and this garb has looked very different in different ages, what then is religionless Christianity? Religion for Bonhoeffer in these texts tends to have a negative connotation. When we see it come up in different letters, every time he mentions religion, he seems to be dissing it in some way. And so it seems as though his definition of religion here is this religion, is this desire to have God come and help us. Religion is essentially a framework in which we're the little human and we need God to come in from outside and sort us out and go away again. And that's what he's critiquing. So what is religionless Christianity? What does Christianity look like when we take religion away from it? Well, here's a partial answer to that question. And he answers that question by thinking about the church. And he says, our church has been fighting during these years only for its self-preservation, as if that were an end in itself. It has become incapable of bringing the word of reconciliation and redemption to humankind and to the world. So the words we used before must lose their power be silenced. And we can be Christians today in only two ways: through prayer and in doing justice among human beings. All Christian thinking, talking, and organizing must be born anew out of that prayer and action. And so we can gather that religionless Christianity for Bonhoeffer looks like this. It looks like being Christian by praying and doing justice among human beings, getting stuck into the world and trying to do some good, trying to enact justice and praying for people. But actually, all the words, and we'll drill down a bit more into this concept of these words we used before, but he's essentially saying the church needs to just be quiet for a little bit, because all we've been trying to do is preserve our institution, preserve ourselves. And that's not the point of church. And we've made a big mistake by trying to just do this. And we need to be quiet, pray, try to do justice in the world among humans. And we'll see, he then talks about what he thinks will happen next. But it's a really interesting take, isn't it? That if you're in a massive crisis, this is a world war, you've already said a couple of years before that you think the church has to kind of take on part of the guilt for what's happened. And then to say, well, we're not just going to build a bigger, better, stronger church to do this. We're just going to have to basically just shut up and pray and try to do justice. What's really interesting in this particular quote for me is that it does reveal what he thinks the church should be for. It should really be bringing this word of reconciliation and redemption to humankind in the world, and that's what it hasn't been doing. And so that's kind of part of the problem, right? That the church hasn't been bringing this word of reconciliation and redemption. And that's why it needs to rethink really its strategy, and that Christian thinking, talking, and organizing must be born anew. So hopefully this is still all clear. Please do wave if you have any questions, or unmute yourselves and shout. Okay. So that's during the war, this idea of silence, of humility of the church. But what about after the war? Well, surprisingly, Bonhoeffer is a little optimistic about what could happen after the war. And he says it's not for us to predict the day, but the day will come when people will once more be called to speak the word of God in such a way that the world, there should be that the world is changed and renewed. There's that idea of renewing the world again through the work of the church. It will be in a new language, perhaps quite non-religious language, but liberating and redeeming, like Jesus's language, so that people will be alarmed and yet overcome by its power. Alarmed in a good way, not alarmed in a terrified way. The language of a new righteousness and truth, a language proclaiming that God makes peace with humankind and that God's kingdom, is drawing near. Until then, the Christian cause will be a quiet and hidden one, as we've just seen, but there will be people who pray and do justice and wait for God's own time. So he doesn't think in the midst of this crisis that that's it for the church. He just thinks that we're undergoing a time of crisis out of which the church will emerge in a new form, speaking this new language. And on the idea of language, Bonhoeffer develops this concept of talking in non-religious words. And so, and we've talked about this already today, and in a lot of ways, Bonhoeffer's work is very prescient for our own context now. He says, well, there are lots of words that we use in the church that actually don't mean a lot to people outside the church. When we talk about receiving grace, when we talk about sin, when we talk about redemption, yes, some people might have an inkling of what that means. Some people might have more of an idea, but lots of people if you ask them what does redemption mean, they won't be able to tell you. These are words that have just, you know, as we let go of Christian ideas as a culture, we let go of these words, and we don't all know what they mean anymore. So there'll have to be a new way of communicating these concepts to the world in words that they will understand. And actually, interestingly, he tries to do this in some fiction that he writes while he's in prison. He writes the short story where there are no words, there's no Christ, God, church, salvation, sin, redemption. None of those sort of theologically loaded words appear in that text at all. And it's the story of a prison guard who's been fighting at the front and who's wounded and who comes back to work in the prison and who tries to reform the prison system essentially and make sure the prisoners have enough to eat and things like that. He's clearly a Christ figure, but there's no Christian or religious language in the entire text. So we can see here that Bonhoeffer is really trying to figure out a new way of communicating Christian truths, if you like, without using any of these words that he thinks are now not really well understood. So the church after the war, the role of the church will still be the same, you know, to speak these words of righteousness and reconciliation. And he's hopeful that there will be a new way of doing this. Before we get to an opportunity for chat and questions, I just wanted to share with you, the geek in me wanted to share with you just a little bit about how we know about all of this correspondence, because Bonhoeffer wasn't allowed to write just as much as he wanted from prison for a long time. Eventually he makes friends with some of the guards, one in particular, and he smuggles correspondence in and out of the prison for him. But at the beginning of his imprisonment, he's very, very limited in terms of what he can send out of the prison. And so I just wanted to show you on the right here, we have this decoded message. And what they would do, Bonhoeffer would ask for a book to be delivered to him so that he could read a book in prison. And then he would, starting from the back, underline a letter every so often throughout the book. And then he would say, right, my book is ready to be collected. I've read it. Can you bring me another book? And his family would collect the book and would look at all the underlined letters throughout and would work out what the message was. So it's a very intense way of, first of all, communicating basic facts. You know, he's just trying to tell his family what's happening, but also communicating theological ideas. The bigger letters that we have that you were reading for today are not communicated in this way. I mean, that would be just impossible. But it's interesting to see how some of his fragmentary texts were conveyed to the outside world. And the picture on the left here is several members of Bonhoeffer's family. And we think that this is one of the guards with his back to us right here, having just brought some correspondence from Bonhoeffer out of the prison. So I just wanted to give you some kind of real life context of how we've managed to get all these texts. All right, I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can have a bit of a chat. I can pull up some of the slides again if we want to see some of the texts again. All right. Any questions just to kick us off? Oh, there's something in the chat. Right, yeah, Judy, that's a really interesting point. The use of telling stories for communicating with ordinary people. Absolutely, yeah. Yes, Paul, go ahead.
I've got very quickly, three questions, very quickly put them together. When you're talking about like he was in prison and talking about like, all right, in prison, but maybe a bit afterwards about the importance of prayer and action. When I read his stuff, he talks a lot about the importance of community and the way in which it's only as community can we actually, the word of God can come to us and through us. So I'm just wondering how that fits in with what you said. And then the second question is this thing about taking on the guilt of the world. How did he make that happen? How can you do that? I mean, how can you take on the guilt of the world? I mean, who are you to do that? How can it be done? How can you take on guilt if the guilt is not being wanted to be taken on by you know, I can understand saying that we are the church, but for the world, how can you do that? And the third question is, how does the idea of when in the letters, when he talks about that musical reference of the Caro Furis or whatever it is, you know, that getting this one theme right, that it allows everything else to come into play. How does that again relate to both this religionless Christianity and to what you said about the world?
Okay, I like a list of questions. Right, first question, community. Yeah. You're absolutely right that a lot of Bonhoeffer's earlier writings focus on community and focus on the fact that it's often through other people within a Christian community that we hear God's word spoken. When he's in prison, he writes about not being in community. He writes about being alone in his cell and how difficult that is for him. And I think that the link there, if you like, or how he works through that, is by thinking about how people who are living these lives that are so fragmented by the war, who are living apart from each other, apart from their communities, are still able to do these, what he's describing as these two core Christian things, you know, doing justice and praying. That's how people can still be Christians and be church, if you like. And then he's looking ahead to a time when people won't have these same impositions or limitations put upon them, and they'll be able to gather again and communicate this word of reconciliation in a new way. Yeah, it's interesting. He talks about longing for community in prison, but he doesn't do much more theological reflection about it because he's not in that context. So we kind of leave that behind a little bit when we get to the prison texts. Taking on of guilt. This is something that he sees, what's the word I'm looking for? He sees Jesus as an example of that, right? In the crucifixion, there's Jesus taking on the guilt that is not his. And he says, as Christians, we have to be prepared to do that as well, and to not say, oh, well, that wasn't really my fault. That was, you know, that was Steve's fault, and I'm not really involved with that. Sorry, my hands are clean, particularly in the context of the Second World War, right? Because it would be so tempting to say, well, I'm a good Christian and I don't agree with Nazism, so I'm just going to be over here by myself like a good person and not, and you know, tell God I didn't do anything. And he's saying, no, we can't detach ourselves from our context in that way. We're all caught up in this guilt, and we can't pretend that we've managed to keep our hands clean. And that's a very important part of his theology, in fact, particularly because of the example of Jesus exactly not doing that, not trying to keep his hands clean in the incarnation. I'm afraid I've now forgotten your third question.
It's when he talks about that you're using that musical metaphor, Carlo Fusis, and then talks about how if you get that right in the living, then everything else will, you know, the human love or everything else can come together. You know, like having this one thing that if you get the one thing right, everything else fits in and comes together. So I'm just looking at how you might want to relate that.
Yeah. Do you know what? I don't know. I remember the bits about polyphony, but I don't remember that musical analogy. I'll have to go away and think about that.
It's on the same page as that. Yeah, it's a big thing, I think.
Okay, I'll have to go away and think about that. Thanks for that question. Okay, we've got Simon and Michelle and Jeff. Shall we take these questions as a 3 and then see if we can build a discussion? So Simon. You're muted, Simon.
So a lot of what you've outlined sounds very much like the kind of demythologizing project, you know, and I wonder whether there's a direct line of connection between, you know, the demythologizing theology of the, you know, the sort of second half of the 20th century and Bonhoeffer. Do they trace their origins back to Bonhoeffer?
Well, no, to Bultmann, really.
Bultmann. Okay.
And it's a different project. Yeah, okay, so let's take all the questions and I'll come back. Yeah.
But does it fit in? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. Is that your only question, Simon?
Well, no, I just also had the thing of the social, you know, the social dimension of Christianity again fits in with what Temple was talking about in the Second World War. Was that a pan-European movement, the sort of Christian socialism?
That's a good question. Bonhoeffer's definitely not a Christian socialist, much as some of us might want him to be. He's totally not.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would have to just say a brief no, not connected for that one, but we'll come back to the demythologizing one in a minute. Okay, thanks for that. Michelle?
Yeah, I wanted to just speak a little bit to the taking on someone else's sin. I think that's a spirit of intercession, and in the same way, if you take the issue of Black Lives Matter, you know, there are times when I deeply want to repent of being a white privileged Western Christian for the sins that have been committed against other races in all areas of life. And sometimes I really want men to take the sin on of what and repent of what's been done to women, because I'm still living through that, still reading profiles that excite me, and then I suddenly read this church has signed the resolution, and know that immediately excludes me from applying, you know. So that sense of taking on someone else's sin, I think, is absolutely right and necessary for us to be community in order to identify with one another. And in terms of being community, I think one of the sad negatives that I see coming out of super church in the Western world is that generally speaking, things are only worth and of value if they're an activity that's reaching hundreds of people at the same time, whereas the ministry of Christ was to the one. He said, leave the 99 and go after the one, and he judges the sheep and the goats on whether they've just given a drink of water to the one, and in doing you've done it to Christ. And that's something God speaks to me a lot about, ministering to the one, and that sense that actually that's what mission is about. If every single one of us ministered to the one that God had put in front of us, then the world would be transformed. It's when we sit back, when we don't identify with each other's pain and suffering, when we don't minister to the one in front of us, that nothing gets done. And it goes to that saying, anybody could have done it, but somebody thought, you know, another body was going to do it, and in the end nobody does it. So
Okay, thanks for that, Michelle. We'll come back to those points that you've raised. And then we had, was it Jeff? Yeah.
Just an observation to try and get deeper into what Bonhoeffer means by religionless Christianity. I noticed that while he was in prison, he lamented the fact that he couldn't receive the sacraments and how much he wished he could. So it'd be interesting to see within his understanding of what religionless Christianity means, what some of those absolute core elements of the life of the church actually, where they have their place.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. All right, let's just regroup and feel free to chip in with comments as we go. So we're going to go back and talk about demythologizing. So yeah, Bultmann has a bit of a different project from Bonhoeffer's project, because he, taking the myths out of the biblical narrative is different to thinking of new language in which to express theological truth. So in that sense, they're quite different projects. It's true that they have a lot of the reasons for why they want to do those two projects are quite similar. They want to make the biblical stories more relevant. They want to make Christianity seem more relevant to people, and they recognize that society is changing, and that is the driving force behind the changes that they want to make. But their projects are rather different. But it's true that we see a lot of this type of reflection happening around this time period. A lot of theologians are starting to say, oh, wow, the world is really changing, and we need to think about how we are going to communicate the Bible. How are we going to communicate who Jesus is in a way that's relevant to people in this changing culture? So there's a lot of those types of questions cropping up at around this time. And although they're not doing the same thing, they talk about each other. So Bonhoeffer mentioned Bultmann in his letters and papers. They're aware of each other's projects. Taking on, specifically Bonhoeffer is talking about taking on the guilt rather than the sin, which is interesting in terms of his choice of language. He's not saying, well, I'm sharing that sin and doing that sin too. It's different, isn't it, when you say, oh, well, I'm taking on the guilt of that sin. The kind of repercussions of that, the sense of being guilty of something is different to saying I'm sharing that sin. So I think the choice of language is really interesting. That's really helpful, Michelle, when you talk about the difference between trying to reach masses of people at the same time. And when we talk about, church success being about church figures and growth and expansion and church planting and all of this, well, sure, those are all great things. But if we miss looking at the real situation in which people find themselves, that's a lack, isn't it? And I think Bonhoeffer would want to say, the danger of not looking at the person and their context is that you're not taking your reality seriously. He's a theologian who, there's a great book about him called Bonhoeffer, Theologian of Reality. And I just love the title because I think that really reflects what he is. He really is committed to taking the world seriously, to taking reality seriously. And if your project is just to, build a massive church, get people through the doors, you're not thinking, well, what about Steve across the road? What does he need? What's his context? So that's really important for Bonhoeffer. This links, Jeff, to your question about what church looks like, what it should look like. He, in prison, develops this idea that he'll call arcane discipline. Discipline of the secret is another way that it's talked about, where he's saying, we have to protect the church. We've seen how it can be usurped by an ideology like the Nazi ideology. We've seen how churches can suddenly have Nazi flags on their altars. The church is something precious that we have to protect from this kind of events, happening to it. And so he says what his solution to this, which again we could discuss, is that Christians will meet between themselves, just, you know, in people's homes, not expecting any space in the public square, to take the sacrament, to baptize, to pray, and to worship, but not to proselytize at this point in time. That's very specific to that location in that time, not to proselytize, not to try to seek a public voice, because he's saying, you know, this is the time of the silence of the church, and we have to protect the church that we have. So kind of two different things going on there for Bonhoeffer in terms of what the church is doing.
Sorry, can I come back on that one, Ellie?
Yeah.
Is that very much in the context that the confessing church was also going to be persecuted, and therefore the practical reality is they would have to operate undercover in that way?
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there's a mixture of undercover and kind of defiant action, right? In the confessing church at the beginning of the war. So the seminary that he's in charge of, that's closed in 1937, they keep meeting. It's not as if Bonhoeffer is like, oh, well, never mind, I'll put my feet up. Too bad. He then, I'm excited about this because it's about skiing. So it's winter in Pomerania. There's like some snow everywhere. And there's an amazing picture of him cross-country skiing, and he's going to meet this group of students that have decided to live together in this house to continue their training. And he's decided, oh, I can make it over there every week for like one class. It's fine. I can go on my Langlauf skis. And so these people are meeting together in these really covert ways. Bonhoeffer isn't allowed to teach or preach or speak in public or anything, but he's still going to teach these. There end up being two different centers of learning that have kind of sprung out of the seminary. And he goes in and teaches them, and they are illegal, those groups at this point, but they're very much still carrying on. Yeah. Yeah, Paul.
And someone brought up, and then you mentioned about Bortman and the project. What I never really quite understood what Bonhoeffer meant when he said, basically sort of saying, yes, Bortman, okay, that's fine, I've got that, but he doesn't go far enough. You know, he's on the right track. What did he mean? What did Bonhoeffer mean when he basically said, okay, but it's not going far enough? Where did he want Bortman to go?
I think he thinks that there's still a lot of religious language attached to Bultmann's project, and he thinks that Bultmann isn't sufficiently taking seriously the context of the people that he's trying to reach. You know, we really have to think about how can we communicate these truths in a way that will make sense to people who are really suffering, who are in this impossible situation, and who honestly don't really, thinks Bonhoeffer, don't really care about religion. So how are we going to reach them? It's just, for him, it's not enough to just talk about, you know, rethinking myths and things like that. It has to be a much more radical project. I'm now curious, I mean, obviously, you know, ask whatever questions spring to mind, but I wonder whether we could think about how Bonhoeffer's context and his ideas about what church is and what it needs to be and how it fails to be that and what it might be in the future, how those things might map on to the context that we're talking about now in this week's module. Are there any echoes did you see, or are there any ideas that you think, well, yes, I can see that makes sense in that context, I would maybe reformulate it like this in my context, and things like that? Simon, you've got your hand up, and then Jane.
Yeah, I was thinking that part of the challenge that we face when it comes to climate change is how to frame it as a spiritual issue, not just a scientific issue. And I think that in order to do that, we need language that is not religious, because people will not understand religious language. If we talk about a sacred world, eyebrows will be raised. But if we talk about, I don't know, we use another image, we may be better understood. And it just struck me that part of that spiritual response of those who would not claim to be Christian is veganism. And that seems to me a profoundly spiritual response, because you are respecting the integrity of every creature and seeking to live in harmony with creation or the world or whatever we call it. And again, it just leads me to question, I suppose, the way in which this sort of spirituality of people is beginning to express itself in our society, in our culture. And I don't think it's going to emerge as particularly Christian. I think it's going to emerge in something like the veganism, which is a much more, it is a kind of much more practical project, if you like.
That's really interesting, and maybe, maybe there's a way in which the church can say, well, there's a really interesting set of reasons behind veganism. There's a really interesting set of goals behind veganism, and I think a lot of what perhaps needs to happen is that the church needs to just demystify itself a little bit. And vegans in the church need to go, yes, I'm a vegan too, and I share your reasons for being a vegan, and I also have my own Christian reasons for being a vegan, and to just, explain things a little bit more in terms that everyone can understand, and to highlight the similarities between Christian action and non-Christian action that are actually, a lot of the time focused towards the same goals. That's a really helpful point, Simon. Does anyone want to jump in on the point that Simon is making specifically? So that, yeah, Mary?
Yeah, it seems to be going back to something you said that Bonhoeffer didn't like, which was sort of basing your arguments on science, because it seems to me that we don't need more than just common sense to indicate that eating meat is not a good thing for the earth. We don't need to bring in Christianity. So it's not something that this church needs to get worked up about any more than anybody else. Does that make any sense? I'm not sure.
I don't know if Simon wants to come back to that with his point about science, or maybe we need to have that simmer away for a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I know that veganism, it's not just a practical response; it's a spiritual response, and it is born out of a deep sense that all living creatures dignity, and it's something that I respect immensely, although I disagree with the sort of, I don't know, the thinking behind veganism, because there are other reasons why living sustainably does not entail being a vegan. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a kind of a language that they use that is very spiritual, but it's not Christian.
Okay, well, maybe wait for that okay, so we have Judy and Keith. Are either of those related to this particular topic? All right. Oh, no, not Keith, but yes, Judy, and then we'll come back to Jane.
I think one of the things we need to do as the church is to listen to the language that people use outside of the church and understand it, because we impose our religious Christian viewpoints sometimes because we're so used to using that language. And if we were to listen and ask people what they meant by it, we'd stand a much better chance of being able to engage with people, and particularly things like veganism or climate change, how communities are destroyed. We've had floods in our own country where people's lives have been altered, businesses are being lost. And if we were just to listen a bit more,
I'm pretty sure that we could find some common language, but I think that means we're going to have to change the language that we use.
Thank you. Okay, so we have Jane, then Rosemary, and then I think Pete, you had your hand up, and Keith. Jane.
Okay, I think my point is similar in some ways. So Chris in the last section was talking about the church moving away from just sharing propositional truth, and he talked about performative apologetics, you know, getting stuck in with social action and food banks and connecting with the community and so on. And for me, that resonates with what Bonhoeffer was saying about maybe we just need to pray and work for justice and not be so keen to speak out. And you know, there seems to be a lot of cross fertilization between those two points.
And it's important to underline just how radical that is, particularly if you're a Lutheran. If you're a Lutheran, you think that, you know, Christ is present in the preached word. And if you're not going to preach the word because you've said that your church has to keep silent, you know, that's huge. And so for Bonhoeffer to say, okay, everyone, now is the time for prayer and righteous action, that is, now it seems like, oh yeah, cool, let's get on board with that. Let's, you know, do some cool stuff and pray. But actually, to say that in 1944 is huge. And I think that, yeah, a lot of people, that's why I'm sort of saying that Bonhoeffer, I think, is actually really relevant for now. I think in his time period, a lot of what he said was just a bit bonkers, really. And he was totally wrong about what the church would look like in the aftermath of the Second World War, totally wrong. But what he is envisaging is actually much closer to what is happening now. So that's why I think he's really relevant. Yeah, thank you for that, Jane. Rosemary.
Mine's a much more sort of surface point. Thinking of change of language. In the Catholic Church, things were changed a bit some years back. And instead of saying one with the Father and the Spirit, we now have to say consubstantial. Now, who knows what that means? Another prayer was altered slightly, and the word you used instead of thou. The number of people in the congregation who will say thou. Why are we using thous and these? Why aren't we using the language of today? And Pope Francis, he wants to go for simplicity. And if you look at so many of our church services, there's so much symbolism that gets in the way of meaning. You know, why are the priests wearing Middle Ages clothing? Why are the altar cloths changed from colour according to different feasts? Who in the congregation cares? Who knows why? And, you know, if only we could get rid of so much and have much more simplicity. I'm all for Bonhoeffer on that.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's, and I must declare my total neutrality on this point. I don't have a dog in this fight, but there are so many people who love that, you know, the changing of the colors through the liturgical year. For them, it's so deeply meaningful, you know, and so I think this is such a difficult question for church. I want to say church management, which I know is the wrong term, but you know what I mean. It's such a difficult question for churches, isn't it? Because on the one hand, there's such a strong argument to say, let's be simple, let's be plain, let's make it clear what we're doing so that people don't have to, you know, think too hard about why we've changed color, you know, because they might not get it. And on the other side, there are the people for whom that's so deeply embedded in their spiritual practice that they, you know, they want to see it. So yes, I'm glad I'm not a church leader, I think, is my yeah, good luck to all of you who are. Fantastic. Pete, you had your hand up, I think.
Indeed. I think just on what Rosemary said, for me, it's about meaning. It's about not people understanding what's going on. Like, we don't have any of those traditions in our church. We have our own set of traditions. But my thinking is about, I guess Bonhoeffer's increasing sense that the church is not fit for purpose, and then being on his own and realizing that it's survivable. And there's lots of parallels from what we've been going through for last year and how we've been trying to hold folk during lockdown, and an increasing sense, in my church at least, among the oldest of people actually say we've got to do things differently. You know, we had a very good model of what we did, but they're still saying, do we have to meet as often? Can we meet differently? We seem to found a whole life that we didn't know was even out there. So I see lots of parallels with that in terms of what Bonhoeffer is saying. So I had a question about whether because he's survived, not physically perhaps, but emotionally, whilst missing the Eucharist, he actually found a sense of, you can survive without going to church on Sunday. Did that help him come to the conclusion of saying nothing? Which for the Lutheran, as it would be for the Baptist, would be incomprehensible. But actually, we've done that for a year, and guess what? The sky didn't fall in. It's in many ways, we've grown, which is great.
Yeah, I had not thought about those parallels, Pete, so that is immensely helpful. Just the isolation that so many people have been experiencing during the pandemic. Obviously, the sense of crisis, I think I had thought of that, hence why I chose this presentation for this module, but I hadn't thought about that sense of isolation, and that's a really good point, and I don't really have a proper answer for you, I'm afraid.
I should perhaps write one.
There you go. It's your essay.
There we go.
Yeah. We've got Helen, Keith, and Jeff. Does anyone want to comment directly onto what Pete's just been saying? Okay, well, I think Keith was there first, and then Helen, and then Jeff.
I was just going to say that it strikes me, putting what you've said about Bonhoeffer together with some of the other things that have been said today, especially by Chris, that well, tell me if I'm right, I may not be right, but what strikes me as extraordinary about Bonhoeffer's approach is the way he combines this radical, these radical notions like religion as Christianity, and a willingness to, and radical notions around religious language, and this commitment to faith that means something in the real world, with, as far as I can tell, an awful lot of theological content, as it were. I mean, he doesn't seem to have, as far as I can tell, he hasn't, rode back from what he said about Jesus Christ in those earlier quotations that you offered, nor has he altered his view of the church as as redeemed humanity. Whereas the more typical attempt to engage, second half of the 20th century, early 21st century attempt to engage in that way involved much more the demythologizing of Bultmann, which was trying to get at some kind of, as I understand it, some kind of existential essence, beyond, the history. Whereas Bonhoeffer's approach is profoundly contextual, historical, cultural, and rooted in that sense. So the combination, in other words, of that kind of deep theological seriousness and indeed very high Christological view, with that commitment to radical approach to the church, seems to me to be utterly unique. But I mean, am I right?
Yes.
And very interesting for now, because
absolutely, yeah.
Not about it's not a sort of watering down. That's what I'm getting at, I think.
It's totally not a watering down, and he's not saying, oh, it's okay, everyone will be, everyone will be fine. We don't really need to think about Jesus that much, as long as we know that Jesus loves everyone. This is not at all that. It's a detailed, intricate theology, particularly Christology, that leads into this ecclesiology, what he thinks the church is about. But I think what's interesting is that he, in prison and in the years leading up to his imprisonment, he is for the first time dealing with a non-church context. All of his life he's been in church contexts, because even when he's being an academic, he's also being a pastor. He's engaging in the church struggle in Germany, you know, so he never leaves that context until the war and his work for the government and prison. And then he meets all these people who were not Christians, or who used to say they were Christians, and now there's no way they're going to say they're Christians because they've seen how the church collaborated with the Nazi regime. And he thinks, oh, this isn't actually the reality of Germany. It's, you know, my context, sure, that's real, but it's not the only context there is. And so he has to rethink his theological structures to engage with this real world that he's kind of collided with. And that leads to this really interesting, you know, theological powerhouse suddenly going, oh, I have to do theology for this world come of age, where people don't really want to think about God at all. What does that mean? You know, and while he's in prison, he's writing, as I was saying, this piece of fiction where there is no theological language at all. He's also making notes for his next book, which is going to be about the church. It's going to be about Jesus's role in the church. It's a deeply theological, very, very complex book outline that he starts working on. So it's not as if he's planning to abandon his kind of theological publication program, not in the least bit, but he sees both of these goals as important. He has to write for the church, good theological resources for the church so that it knows what it's doing. And he has to write for this context in which people don't know what salvation means, if you say the word salvation. So it's starting to become a dual program, as it were. Yeah, Helen, I think you were. No? No? Okay. Any more for any more? Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, looking at the Bonhoeffer's thinking in the context of the current culture, I was reflecting on the idea of the world come of age. He was writing in the 30s where there was more of a movement to the idea of the God of the gaps. Science has answered all the problems. The white heat of technology was sort of following in the 50s. And even though they were in the crisis of war, there was a confidence in human capacity to resolve problems and move forward. And I would say that now questions of meaning, questions of justice, questions of value, questions of what does it mean, what is a human identity, what does community mean, what does society mean, are ones on which we're drawing more and more blanks. And actually, I think, again, Bonhoeffer's argument was that we would have to see all answers to these questions in the context of our relationship to God. And in a sense, we're getting back to that, not to the point where we looked at the secular spiritual divide and said, if you like, the pendulum swinging back a little bit towards a more spiritual openness. But I think that also really gives us pause to rethink the question, how far does society think we have come of age and have answers to the deeper questions, which may not be defined as spiritual questions, but actually do have spiritual context?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, Jeff. I think I'm not enough of a sociologist to know, what are the trends, how are people beginning to try to answer questions about, as you say, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be in community? And I certainly think, particularly given the data that Chris was just showing us in the previous session, a lot of people might be trying to answer those questions in terms of, spiritual answers rather than classic Christian answers in our context, for sure. I think the kind of classic Christian answer is, well, being a human is just being the creature that God made. Not many people are are saying that right now. But they might be saying, well, being a human being is being in relation to people, is being open to the other person, you know, which is a much more spiritual but not Christian way of seeing things. So you're right, that really opens the question about, well, was Bonhoeffer's time maybe just a bit before where we are now, where people were much more confident in humanity's ability to just solve problems and kind of crack on with things? Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm gonna have to go and question my reading of that now. Yeah. Well, folks, we're drawing towards the end of today's session, but I don't want to cut anyone off who might just have, even if it's you're thinking to yourself, oh, shall I ask that question? It's a bit of a silly question. Yeah, Michael.
I was thinking the concept of salvation is a very tricky one, which I think a lot of Christians have problems with it sometimes, and I think certainly people outside of the church would perhaps to some extent think it's a slightly bonkers sort of concept. And I remember being on a short course a few years ago where we were discussing this, and we were put into small groups, and we had to come up with a different word or phrase, as many different words or phrases as we could think of that we thought were alternative expressions for salvation. And I think altogether, out of the whole group, we came up with about 30 or 40 very interesting things. I remember things like healing, restoration, renewal, and lots of other things which felt to us far more meaningful and expressive just because this sort of traditional religious language over time tends to kind of lose its meaning, I guess. And another thing which has occurred to me really during this pandemic, I've come across expressions like no one is safe until everyone is safe, and that sort of thing. In other words, we have to have this situation where we've achieved this herd immunity or whatever. And I wonder if that's kind of related in a way with Bonhoeffer's idea of taking on this societal guilt. That, you know, can we say we are saved when we're living in the midst of a society which has clearly gone very badly wrong?
That is a fascinating question. Interestingly, Bonhoeffer writes from prison to his friend Eberhard Bethge about salvation. And he says, I'm not thinking about personal salvation anymore. Who knows? We can only talk about collective salvation. What's going to happen to us at this point? I would need to go back to look at the exact words. He may not say collective salvation, but he's talking about the humans as a whole. And he definitely does say, I'm not thinking about my own individual salvation anymore. And there's this sense that for him, that's kind of, it's beside the point. You know, there's a bit in his earlier work where the famous bit, right, of Bonhoeffer, where he decides to be part of the group that is trying to assassinate Hitler. And he was a pacifist, and so everyone goes, well, how can you be a pacifist and then be okay with assassinating Hitler, you know? And he writes in his ethics a lot about that. I won't go into it, but there's this sense that he doesn't know whether that's the right thing. He doesn't know if God thinks it's the right thing, but as far as he can tell, he thinks it's probably the right thing. And then he has to be okay with the possibility that he might have got it wrong. and he has to take responsibility for himself in that moment. He doesn't just say, well, God told me to do it, so I know it's fine. But I think it's what I should do, and I hope it's what God thinks I should do. I'm going to do it. We'll see. So there's this point where he's clearly not sure, does that mean I won't be saved any longer if I do this thing and it turns out that God thought this wasn't what I should do and it's in fact a really terrible thing to do? Will I still be saved? He then kind of gets past that. Oh, well, never mind. What counts is how we as a group of humans can deal with this crisis that we're facing, the Nazi crisis. And that, again, I hadn't put that together with what you were just saying about the pandemic, that, to think in terms of my individual safety or my family's safety, we're all tempted to do that. But at the same time, we have to think beyond those units to a kind of more at a societal level, and for governments at a global level too, right? It's not just about protecting my country, it's about protecting people from whatever country, which is also an ethical challenge that governments are facing right now. Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, Judy. And then we will close.
I was just, I'd made some notes on the pre-reading, and it's the thoughts on the day of baptism, and it's page 297. And it just struck me afresh, but we've learnt by experience that we cannot plan, even for the coming day, that what we've built up has been destroyed overnight. And it struck me the parallels that we've got with this current pandemic. The church, we're so good at planning, aren't we? The church is really good at planning. We plan for the future, and we have all our meetings, and we have strategies, and that's good, but it's about holding things lightly, isn't it? And I think the pandemic has taught us all that unexpected things happen, and it completely turns our thinking upside down. He says, if we can save our souls unscathed out of the wreckage of our material possessions, let's be satisfied. And that's just so true for now, isn't it? Because I guess we all kind of think about, well, I've kind of gone past my sort of employed. I'm not employed now. I work as a volunteer, but all of those things that we kind of hold close, and the world is kind of planning and moving towards buying and selling houses and things, and somehow this pandemic has leveled us all, hasn't it? We're all on a level playing field, really, because we're all having to deal with the same stuff, and it just makes you think about how we minister in the community, how we care about people and love people in the community and our family and ourselves, actually. But yeah, that it's really touched me. This, if you haven't read through it, there's some really good stuff in that. The detail about the baptism, and he's writing the letter to his nephew, great nephew, and he's saying, you're going to be a living bridge between those generations and the next generations, and there's all that wisdom that comes from being the living bridge. And certainly that's made me think about, what are the things that I want to take on board, not just about the pandemic, but what are the things that are valuable, that we all hold, all the wisdom we've accumulated over the years, and how do we manage it, look at what we believe, change our views or not change our views, and impart that so that it's meaningful for somebody else.
Well, thank you, Judy. Helen, was that a raised hand this time? Yes. Okay. Then I did say we'll close, but we'll just listen to you, Helen, and then we'll close. You're muted. You're still muted.
Press the space bar.
Sorry, I completely disappeared. The screen went totally blank then. Sorry. Yeah. I was just going to say, as a health professional, I in some ways, I not disagree, is not the right word, but I just want to say that actually, I don't think that the pandemic has leveled us. I think it's done exactly the opposite, because the people, there's so many people who've suffered, and it's the poor. And, you know, our middle class, nice little lives have protected us. So I think we need to, you know, just be very careful before we start thinking it's leveled, because it certainly hasn't. Because if you look at rates of deaths and illness and everything like that, when you look at people from different ethnic groups, it hasn't leveled us at all. It's just actually brought out the inequalities in life so much more. And I think we just need to put that into the equation when we're looking at how the church responds as well. So.
Yeah, that's a really helpful point, Helen. Thank you. Yeah, and certainly there's a very great difference between me and my job, which I can do cozily from my study at home, and someone else's job where they're on intensive care wards on massive shifts. So yeah, you're absolutely right. On that note, facing the reality in which we live, I think we should close for today. And if you had any questions from today, please do keep them, because we have a session on Thursday where we're going to be doing some discussion and recaps. I should have said this morning when we started, in that session on Thursday, we're going to be taking a question from everybody, a question or a comment about something that has been going through your mind all week. So do come with something, even if it's just a question, you know, in session 3, I did not understand X, because we'll be using all of those comments from everybody as starting points for our conversation. So be prepared to talk for 2 or 3 minutes about a question or a comment that you've had as the week goes on for Thursday.
And just to add to that, if I might, Ellie, when we have the tutorial session on Wednesday, I mean, there'll be quite a few of you who are not going to be doing essays as a result of participation in this because you're auditing. That doesn't mean that, I mean, you don't have to have a tutorial, but the opportunity is there in the tutorial to have some of that discussion. So you can have that one-to-one discussion, and you can think about how you can apply stuff that you've been thinking about and we've been talking about to your own context and situation. So for those who are going to go on and do the MA essay, the tutorial is going to be primarily about thinking about the essay. But for those of you who are not, it's an opportunity just to think more widely about application.
Great, thank you, Keith. All right. On that note, I'll stop recording and wish you a very good evening, and we reconvene at 9:15 tomorrow morning.
Bye.
Thank you all very much. See you then.
Thank you.